Record. So, hello, good afternoon. Welcome everyone to our Friday event series here at the Language Center at Columbia University. Today we are hosting Chris Case and Claudia Kelly, his assistant, who together will be collaborator. I'm sorry. Chris will later introduce Claudia as well, who together will be telling us about the project that they developed with the Instructional Innovation Grant awarded by the Language Resource Center. I don't want to spoil the details or all too much, but the project will be about inclusive learning in the Polish language classroom, the Polish language curriculum. So I'm going to leave it at that. And I will also, at this point, pass the microphone over to Chris and Claudia, who will flesh out the project for us. Yeah, I think we can proceed.
Okay. All right. Wonderful. Thank you, Simon, for the introduction. And hello, everyone. We're really happy to see you folks here on a Friday afternoon. I know most of you. I am Christopher Case, the lecturer in Polish here at Columbia University. And my colleague is Claudia Kelly, who is a graduate student in the Slavic department, completing a PhD on a comparative Polish-Russian topic. And she is also a language instructor.
Yes.
And you have taught both Polish and Russian, if I'm not mistaken.
Indeed.
You taught first year Polish 2020 and 2021.
Correct. And then the year before I did Russian.
Okay. All right. Wonderful. And so we're going to talk about our grant. I just wanted to give a quick shout out to our guest, Dorota here. Dorota Drużałowska. I'd like to welcome her to our language teaching community. She is a visiting scholar from Poland who has been awarded a visiting scholar status at the Herman Institute and is working on a project on phraseology in Slavic languages, the influence of English. And so welcome to Dorota, and we hope to see you at some future language teaching events.
Thank you for invitation for today. Thank you for invitation.
Okay, well, we're going to jump into this and we're going to open a PowerPoint now. We're going to share a screen here.
Yes. Okay. Just take us back. And
And so can folks see our screen? Awesome. Okay. So the formal title of our grant was Addressing Diversity, Intersectionality, and Social Justice in the Polish Language Classroom. This was a instructional innovation grant that we had in 2022. And so we are reporting on it. Things evolved a bit in the process of working on the grant. And so we'll talk a little bit about our thought process and how we went through things. A little bit about the impetus for applying for the grant. We became aware of an acute lack of diversity with respect to race, gender identity, sexual orientation, also disability, ethnic identity in contemporary Polish language textbooks. Most character arcs were sort of embedded in heteronormative, white, cisgender contexts. No textbooks were offering any instruction on terms or self-appellations for people of color, for members of the LGBTQ community. And so, and this is something that would come up on a regular basis, as a matter of fact. In my experience, on the first day of class, very often students were asking, so what are non-binary pronouns in Polish? How are people of color referred to in Polish? So it is our desire, I think, to generate these skills for our students that has motivated us to apply for this grant. And if you look at the bottom of our slide there, I note that the CU Polish Studies program is no different than the student body across the university system of the United States. It's quite diverse. Between 2016 and 2021, the student body in Polish language courses at Columbia was anywhere from 20 to 60% made up of students of color. These students do not have the opportunity to see themselves represented in the materials that we use to teach the language. And the white students do not learn the skills to interact respectfully and refer to their non-white and non-gender conforming peers. So in any case, that's a little bit about the impetus behind the project. So we set about it, I suppose, as a research question first, and we decided simply to undertake a review of existing Polish language textbooks and ask ourselves what images of diversity were present in the textbooks, and a later question, what underlying ideologies of identity and difference could be seen to be motivating the decision to represent certain groups or certain races or certain sexualities in Polish language textbooks. And we're going to sort of take you through our breakdown here. We kind of came up with a framework of 4 basic stances. And although we don't have a nice graph here plotting it in time, it is kind of chronological with the earliest, with the first elements on the list going back to say the 1970s or 80s, and the end numbers 3 and 4 sort of characterizing contemporary Polish language textbooks today. So both Claudia and I will present a little bit about these textbook stances which we have identified in commercially available Polish language textbooks in North America. This is what we spent a lot of time on actually during our grant. We did this sort of substantive review. I'll jump in here with the first one, going back to older textbooks from the 1970s. And again, these are just selected images that we've pulled out here that we have decided to show as representative. We noted a stance which we referred to as casual chauvinism in textbooks of the 1970s and 1980s. The example that I pulled out here is one in which, in a line drawing in the text, you see a group of people on a tour, and the heroine of the textbook is this dark-haired woman in the center of the image, and her name is Mary. And the dialogue is based on a situation in which she does not understand why no one in her group is paying attention to the tour guide. As you can see, all of the men in the group are observing the blonde woman who is leaning over the edge of the observation deck there. So in any case, a textbook authored by 2 women, but nevertheless containing elements in which sort of a casual everyday misogyny or chauvinism towards women is incorporated, I believe, as an element of humor for the learner audience. So that's an example from the 1970s. And
Okay, so I'm going to jump in with this second type, the studied neutrality or silent omission. This is the textbook these are the textbooks where you find the central narrative around white cisgender and the heterosexual experience, right? So when you're looking through these books, you find the narratives, often love stories. There's one in Cześć about the love triangle that's between, I guess, 2 men and 1 woman, 2 men interested in the same woman. And so the main problem here is you are given a bunch of vocabulary that's limited to this kind of experience. So, for example, when I was reading textbooks and learning Polish at the early stages, I often didn't have the language to describe my own experience. So not only is it an issue of not seeing my own, seeing myself represented in the narrative arcs, but also a question of how do I then describe, my family circumstances, who I am and where I come from. Okay, let's move on. So this is just a short image of the kind of typical narrative fictional arc that you get is between, white cisgender, a heterosexual relationship. And then
I'll jump back in here now and refer to a more contemporary textbook, which first appeared in the sort of late 2000s, I guess, 2010 2010, although I think it was 2009 actually.
Mhm.
There is a sort of breakthrough here in terms of diversity. The textbook Kropo Kroku, which is actually I am using currently at Columbia University. I inherited it from my predecessor here. It was written by 4 women, one of whom declares herself to be a feminist, and there is a greater sense of a program to be inclusive in this textbook. 2 of the 4 main characters are non-white. There is a Latino character, or a white Hispanic character, and an Asian character, and an episodic gay male character. So here, this was the first textbook that really included a broader diversity of characters. However, note that I call this stance, the stance that we've identified in this textbook, or rather the stance, I suppose, that we are using this textbook to exemplify as a language teaching framing of diversity, is ironic framing. And so why ironic framing? Oops, what happened here? Because essentially, even though the diversity of the cast was broadened, still characters were presented through the lens of national and gender stereotypes. So for instance, the Japanese girl is very shy. The man from Argentina, the student from Argentina, sort of bizarrely is womanizing. And as a matter of fact, there is a dialogue in which he has to be removed by security from a museum for harassing a woman. And his comment is, "I always thought Polish women liked romantic men." So quite a bizarre scene to include in a language textbook. The German man stereotypically is a workaholic. He's also quite misogynist. And one of his neutral dislikes that he presents in conversation is, "I can't stand talkative women." And the Polish characters themselves are also quite stereotyped. The husband is lazy and avoids house chores. The Polish wife is overworked. And one has to wonder, what is the purpose of these stereotypes? My sense is that the team of women writing the textbook thought of them deconstructively. In other words, the stereotypes were offered as elements to be seen through, not taken seriously. They were seen obviously as moments for the injection of humor, but also that people are not really like that, and we all know that. Nevertheless, we are going to use stereotypes as a way of teaching vocabulary. And as a matter of fact, racist language is taught in the textbook. And so, for instance, the Japanese character will present herself as a typical Japanese girl, talking about her eyes as dark and slanted. The fact that this itself is not felt to be entirely appropriate, I believe, is evidenced in the fact that this type of thing is removed from the 2nd volume of the textbook, at least in the main book. It still appears in the supplemental materials. And I have myself gone through and removed it from the 1st volume of the textbook. It is only a part of her self-presentation. Other characters do not refer to her using this language, but the authors of the textbook present the Japanese character as describing her appearance in a self-appellation, in what is in contemporary Polish a racist way. So that's ironic framing, which leads me to the larger question: what is the role of fiction in language teaching instruction? These are things that we are reflecting on as we produce our own materials. Many of these textbooks are heavily serialized, invested, as Claudia pointed out, in these romantic arcs in which it's all about flirtation and one character falling in love with somebody else's significant other, which essentially brings up all of these sort of heteronormative situations. So how might we, utilize alternative identities, sexualities, to, I suppose, create alternative types of stories that would be non-patriarchal, non-heteronormative, non-white centered? How not to teach stereotypes? In other words, what are the pitfalls in attempting to ironize them and to expect students to have the capability, the skills to see through stereotypes? In other words, when are students supposed to, are students able to know when textbook authors are being ironic and when they're not? So these are all things that we continue to reflect on and will hope to pursue in a new installment of the grant. I'm going to turn it over to Claudia again, since we have yet another stance to talk about.
Yes. So before we move on to that, I do want to add, so that in this question of kind of when we're investing our textbooks with these fictional narratives, we see this problem coming up of the stereotypes, and you have people who don't identify as the narrative of the characters that they're writing. They're investing these stories with this harmful language and stereotyping. So is then the answer to not use fiction. And here I'm going to jump into awkward principledness as the fourth stance. And that's something that they, I think, try to grapple with by including, I guess, more authentic materials. And so in their expansion of content, so they're including more voices, different backgrounds, and additional storylines. Here we have the story of Eric. You can see him in the right upper corner. And so they include like an authentic narrative, someone's real story, and they even have him speaking. If you want to jump in a little bit about what he's.
Yes, Eric, he presents a self-narrative, and he makes a grammatical mistake in his self-narrative, which is corrected in the transcript
Right.
for the student learner, and his phonetics are quite non-standard, but it's also clear in his self-presentation that he's reading from a prepared text, since word boundaries are broken up in awkward ways. So it's a sort of an awkward moment, because the genuine self-presentation of the Polish speaker was not felt to be, it seems to me that it was not felt to be normative enough to present students with in an unfiltered way. And so we have a situation where his identity is being scripted for the purpose of presenting a more monolithic view of grammatically standard Polish.
Right. So then we're riding this line of, is this really an authentic material if we're having the authors of the textbook correct the way that he is speaking Polish? And then that always, of course, raises this question of, to what degree should the Polish be corrected if this is a textbook to try to teach people one standard Polish? But then you, of course, run into the ethical dimensions of this, of, you know, saying that this is his narrative, but it's also a narrative that's been scripted. So to move on to another example, below you see there's an exercise where students are asked to describe the people that they see in these images. They have not been given the necessary vocabulary to do so. And as a language teacher, I've been in classrooms where this has come up and students try to invent language, relying on, you know, they've learned the colors. So then they try to apply that directly to their way of describing each of these people. And that itself then leads the students to inadvertently end up either, you know, not maybe using offensive language, but certainly not polite or a correct way of identifying these people. So what we're trying to think about here is, how can we set the students up for success in terms of properly identifying people and using a more delicate language around them? So we're going to keep going with awkward principledness into the latest edition of Hurra po polsku. And this came out in 2021. And in this edition, they try to integrate, I guess, a more contemporary socio-political topics, but the language that they do so in ends up being harmful, right? So this question of below here, you see a wave of foreigners flooding Poland.
Yeah, right. Oops, sorry, dang it.
No, not a problem.
The
Right down here where it says 4A.
Yeah.
And even a more contemporary pamphlet that has been put out says that this kind of language of flooding, invasion, it's very offensive, it's very harmful, and it's especially when referring to migrants or refugees and those seeking asylum. So then the students themselves are replicating this language. And where did the language of, like, for example, the flood that we're seeing here, the flood or the wave of foreigners flooding Poland, where do we see that? That comes in earlier chapters talking about natural disasters. So that kind of associative link in the student's mind is only going to lead them kind of to stumble down the road when they're trying to describe these situations that they would treat very delicately in English and with more appropriate language, but they're not being set up here to do so. And then below we see this kind of, we have images of a family and also a quote unquote someone else who is from a different country but staying in Poland, and there's this effort in the images to almost portray people visiting Poland as kind of the right type of, you know, foreigner, and an overemphasis on all of the achievements that these people have done. And so then that creates this question of what is the kind of right type of foreigner visiting this country. Okay. And then lastly on this topic, as you can see, this is one that we're really interested in because we're seeing it more and more in the contemporary texts. So here we have two images that are against homophobia in Poland. And if we take the image of a father who is a prominent Polish actor, if I'm not mistaken, and it's almost as though he's there to authorize his son who's gay, to authorize this is okay. I support him. I'm in solidarity. So why do we need the people who are not in the marginalized community to kind of show that this is okay? We can accept this. We can authorize these identities, these lives, right? So we're just kind of questioning, how do we present this in a way that's not going to end up being inadvertently harmful? Anything else we want to add to this?
Note also the
yes.
the over on the bottom left-hand side, let's give one another the sign of peace, an explicitly religious gesture towards the LGBTQ community that would theoretically, I suppose, go both ways. You know, if the church accepts people from the LGBTQ community, then they must also, I suppose, accept the role of Catholicism in Polish public life. So there is certainly an anxiety around any type of difference that somehow it must be immediately appropriated or assimilated into a more mainstream familiarity.
Okay. I think
maybe we can skip that.
Yeah,
one.
I think we
we'll
covered
skip that
this.
one. And so we are, as we move through our presentation here, I want to do one more thing yet, but so we're kind of wrapping up our discussion of the textbooks and the various stances that we have seen in them. You know, as we move to author new materials, and this has been a real challenge for us, we have found ourselves asking quite profound questions about the speakers of the language. Above all, whose language is it? Is it a national language? Does it belong to the nation? Who are Poles? What types of hyphenated identities do we see coming into being in Poland, and how might they take the traditional idea of the nation in different ways? What resources in Polish history might actually be called upon to emphasize racial and gender differences within the previously monolithic understanding of the nation? And so this is one thing that we have really found right now, is that so much of this is in flux because of contemporary history. It's actually, I think what we've been finding is that despite often not having all of the answers for contemporary students, we are at the same time able to say that it is an exciting time to be studying Polish because of things in transition. And so, for instance, since the textbooks that we just discussed came out, they've immediately, in a sense, become obsolete due to, 3 waves of events which moved through Poland in the recent past. The impact of Black Lives Matter in Poland, in which the Polish Black community addressed the majority community and stated and made themselves known. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, so here you can see in some of the images next to Polish Black Lives Matter, stop calling me Murzyn. So this is a term that you see, I think, in early 20th century poetry that there's a debate over Tuwim's
I see.
poem.
Yes. Mhm.
It's taught in school, and there's this image of the Murzyn, and it's associated with kind of the harmful images of, you know, the African as someone who's, you know, uncultured, I believe, very simple. And so you create this kind of cultural semantic field around this word that is associated with stereotypes. Chris was talking to me earlier about a couple idioms.
Yes. The debate is about the status of the Polish word Murzyn, which many speakers of the language, white speakers of the language, claim is neutral. But nevertheless, it exists in many idioms in which it's clear that it is used as a racial slur.
And so because of kind of the international attention that we saw on Black Lives Matter in the summer of 2020, you have protests erupting in Poland. And it's not necessarily a kind of one-to-one comparison of what the issues are, of course. In Poland, it was around this term. And so you saw the Black community in Poland saying, don't call me this. And I think it's still, would you say that it's completely accepted by the Polish population?
That what?
Out of not using the word Murzyn?
It's probably not accepted, no. I believe that more and more people are realizing that the Black community does not wish to hear the word used. I imagine that there is probably still work to be done among the majority white community to sort of bring about that awareness.
But there's a lot more, you know, even on social media, Instagram accounts, even on Facebook, about trying to bring awareness to kind of what this word means. And it's not just a neutral term, right? So that it has all of these associations, and that the Black community doesn't want to be called it is the biggest thing.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah. And then, of course, the other movements, the women's strike, which was in response to the new anti-abortion legislation introduced by the ruling party. And then, of course, the pushback against the anti-LGBT free zones, which were declared by local conservative governments in primarily southeastern Poland, but, you know, throughout the country. So these waves of protest come after the publication of our textbooks, and B, have had a fairly significant impact in the contemporary discussion of ethics of language in Poland. So it's a wonderful opportunity to be drawing on these movements, these moments, and to produce new teaching materials. Should we keep going here?
Yes.
In terms of new stories, one thing, a couple of things that we've been thinking about are, looking at the past and opening up things which are considered to be settled. For instance, Kazimierz Pułaski, a famous Revolutionary War hero of the American Revolution. He died in the American Revolution in Georgia, leading a cavalry charge, and he is a Polish national hero. Many prominent monuments in the US and in Poland are named after him. In any case, his remains were recently exhumed and analyzed, and the possibility exists that he was an intersex individual. There has been massive resistance against that idea in Polish conservative circles. Nevertheless, it is quite a profound way of dramatizing the way in which gender can upset received notions of history. And we can, use the past, use existing materials to help rethink Polish identities. Do you want to talk about Komornicka?
So I think before we get to Komornicka, I want to mention that this is, earlier we talked about how, there's a problem with including these fictional narratives in Polish textbooks. But here we have these really interesting, they're not contemporary stories, but we're redigging into the past and finding these stories that, maybe, I guess, the more quote unquote traditional mainstream would either push against or even bury, right, or oversimplify. And we're going to try to figure out how to incorporate them into our new materials.
Great. Okay, wonderful. So for instance, Maria Komornicka or Piotr Odmieniec-Włast, a transgender poet who is seen by many in the transgender community as sort of a founding figure. And then Kent Washington, who was here just this past spring and has since published a wonderful memoir about being a Black basketball player in Cold War Poland, and has embraced his Polishness. And so offers another wonderful way of diversifying the Polish language classroom.
How are we doing on time?
I think we're doing okay on time. Are we doing okay on time, Simon? Okay, great. Great. So in a sense, that is an outline of our substantive review of the textbooks. B, sort of meta questions that we are taking into the fashioning of new materials. We are not quite at the spot yet to decide to author a textbook of any sort. We are working on materials that might explore, this is an exploratory grant, new avenues. I want to shift gears just a little bit and conclude with a reflection on gender and language and gender in language in Polish. And this arises out of the work that we did examining non-binary forms in Polish. And I don't want to go into the forms themselves so much as sort of reflect on the debate itself as it is occurring in the language teaching community or in the popular community. And one thing that I really noted was the impact of English as an implicit standard on the idea of gender in language. And across a broad swath of writing, there is the perception that natural gender languages or gender neutral languages are somehow more progressive or advanced than heavily gendered languages like Polish, and they are sort of implicitly seen as somewhere in the past on the scale of gender awareness. And that sort of sets up a lose-lose situations for learners of heavily gendered languages if the very idea of the expression of gender as a natural operation is somehow stigmatized as being inherently discriminatory. So in my sense, there is an underlying ideology which leans toward the idea of a natural gender language being more advanced. Of course, that is not to say that there is no masculine domination in the Polish language. The masculine gender is seen as the universal or neutral gender in many situations. Abstract pronouns such as who, everyone, no one, someone, these are all masculine gendered pronouns. Even if there are no men in the room, if there are only women in the room, one comes in and says, who called me or who did this, it would all be masculine. Certain prestige professions like president, architect, engineer, minister have only masculine forms, even if they are held by women. And there is a special gender in Polish, special plural gender reserved only for masculine human beings. So on the surface, there is definitely, matter of fact, it's not on the surface. There is a slant towards masculine domination linguistically in Polish, and that seems to compound the problem. So as we were working on non-binary options in Polish, I kind of kicked it up a level and wanted to ask the question, what conceptual potentials are there for us in the classroom in teaching heavily gendered languages, for thinking or even rethinking the relationship between gender and language? In other words, what resources might Polish have that might, in a sense, allow us to, I suppose, see the fluidity of gender as a linguistic construct in a way which we wouldn't be able to see that to be the case in English. And so just a few things here, and then we're wrapping up. One thing is that Polish has 5 genders. That is already a gender bending fact about the language. We have 3 singular genders, he, she, and it, and 2 plural genders, both of which translate as they. However, due to the fundamental asymmetry between the singular and the plural, namely that if in the singular you have men and animals and inanimate objects together in one gender, in the plural, male animals and masculine objects are shifted into the feminine category, creating a purely conventional grammatical gender, which in Polish we refer to either as masculine personal or non-masculine personal. And of course, this, on the one hand, of course, is a reflection of the masculine domination in Polish grammar. However, it also says, it just sort of announces in a very transparent way, both to learners of the language and to native speakers of the language, it announces itself as convention. It's clearly not natural. It's clearly a way of speaking. It's clearly a construct, a way of seizing hold of reality and speaking through it. So yes, to the inherited patriarchal domination. On the other hand, its conventionality itself announces itself as a historical construct. Polish has, uniquely among Slavic languages, nouns in drag. You have words in which you have a kind of crossover between feminine endings on masculine professions or even on the word man. But the underlying adjective reveals the true gender as masculine. So literally a masquerade, a feminine masquerade used for male, people. Obviously, if a woman has a profession for which there is no masculine term, then she herself is then equated to a masculine object in the language. However, then you have the bizarre situation where you have, for instance, a woman driver who will then actually match the gender of the profession, but not because she's a woman, but because the profession itself is in drag and underlyingly masculine. So you have these kind of strange situations in which gender is, very complicatedly juggled in order to work its way through the language. Finally, this is I think a fascinating category, mixed gender groups in Polish. Polish, again, uniquely among Slavic languages, has special numbers for mixed genders. So if you see here, we've got, 2, 3, and 4. These would be the mixed gender numerals all the way up to 99. These would be the numerals used for men, and these would be the numerals used for women. And so why this is important is because in groups, in specific groups, not abstract groups, but in specific groups, when the gender of the members of the group is known to be mixed. So for instance, a couple, a man and a woman together, or a mixed group of any amount of individuals, when speaking as a member of the group, or when addressing a member of the group, or when talking about any member of the group, both men and women will default to neuter, which I think is fascinating because here we have an instance in which even the theoretically grammatically masculine universal, and therefore the linguistic representation of cisgender male speakers itself has to default to neuter. In other words, gender is fluid. So in any case, all of that to say that gender fluidity in Polish is quite striking. It is a heavily gendered language with an inherited masculine sort of slant. On the other hand, the sheer conventionality of the 5 gender grammatical division, the presence of nouns in drag, the behavior of mixed gender groups, plus, as a matter of fact, an operative semantics of linguistic versus natural gender as a basic element of everyday speech. Every Pole knows these 2 words here. We have 2 words, płeć and rodzaj, and they both mean gender. Nevertheless, płeć refers to human gender, or biological sex can only be reused. Well, it can be used to refer to living things. In other words, we have an operative separation at the level of linguistic consciousness into gender as it is realized in grammar, and gender as it appears in a person's identity. Gender and sex, gender in culture, something that we worked very hard on to achieve an understanding of in the English language, is present on the surface of the Polish language. And I believe it's quite close to the level of awareness of native speakers of the language, because as you can see, a complex gender system like this cannot help but come into collision with everyday life and become an object of discussion, of work and reflection, even for native speakers. So again, here, why do I bring this up? Because I think that the larger question for us as teachers of lectals, as teachers of Polish, is not to immediately think that because our languages are heavily gendered, if they are, that we must somehow work around rather than work through those structures. We might even be able to use lectals in the Polish language classroom as a tool to raise awareness about the very conventionality of gender as a fluid element of language itself as a performance. And on that note, since it sounds like there is some construction going on outside our door here, I think we'll wrap up by saying, well, our solutions are what? Get another grant. So look for another application from us in order to continue to make progress on the questions that we presented here today.
Yes.
Thank you. That was our presentation.
All right, let me stop sharing. Okay.
Thank you so much for an awesome presentation. I do have a few questions myself before I open up the floor to comments, contributions, questions from everyone in the audience. I just wanted to remind everyone that the call for our grant for the current funding run for the spring semester has just gone out. I think on Monday. I sent it, I think on Monday. So yeah, it's open for everyone who's interested. We do recommend to get in touch with us to perhaps discuss it before submitting it. And by us, I mean myself here. That way we can sort of together maximize the chances of your projects being funded. And that's the shameless instructional innovation grant plug. And on that note, I'm going to open up the floor to our to the audience. So
Yes.
Hi. Thank you for the very interesting, presentation. My head is a little spinning, but I'm trying to get at what I'm wanted to ask. So like we are all teaching foreign languages in the States.
Yes,
and
yes.
Especially in New York City, which I assume that are a little bit more diverse than any parts of the United States. So we are very keenly aware of all these kind of like linguistic awareness. Like we gotta be a little bit more, I don't want to use a PC, but it just a little bit more diverse. And as you said, that is a social justice oriented language use. And I'm just wondering, like you mentioned, you briefly mentioned, but I'm just wondering, is there what's going on in Poland? Are they aware of this kind of need, or are they maybe they feel the need to be kind of like be a little bit more cautious of the language used to be more inclusive? Or if they do, maybe some of them do, then is there any resistance toward that change? So I'm just wondering about like sociolinguistic landscape in Poland. So.
Yeah, certainly. And I see that Dorota has her hand up and maybe she'll be able to comment on that in just a moment. But yeah, certainly, you're absolutely right. There is a newfound, I suppose, awareness of the effect of language on identity and gender and sexual orientation in Poland, particularly, given the stance of the current conservative government. There's a lot of pushback, certainly, but on the other hand, the Council of the Polish Language, traditionally a sort of bastion of the guardianship of the language itself, stepped in and issued several new directives or suggestions to the community of, journalists, writers, public speakers, how to be ethical in public speech, and referring to, members of the LGBTQ community, migrants, people of color, and so forth. So yes, so to your question about it being New York, certainly New York is more diverse, but this is where our students are. So it is our task to give them the skills to be able to express that diversity, talk about that diversity, share that diversity. Poland itself is slowly becoming aware of its own contemporary diversity. And yes, there is pushback, but yes, there is also a lot of productive work being done. Dorota, you have a question here, and you may also want to comment on that, having just come from Poland
Yes,
a few weeks ago.
in fact, yes, I wanted to comment on that, and thank you very much for your presentation. And for me, it's like, totally new approach and totally new insight to that, because I teach Polish in Polish circumstances in Poland. And the major of the students that I work with are Ukrainian students. So we are still in the very conservative Slavic, working with Ukrainians, working with Russians. It's even more conservative than Polish is itself. So the demand is really low for what you were talking about. Yes, so this is the point that was made about the New York environment, the American environment. It's absolutely unique and absolutely different. There are many things that I would never think, what you were talking about, I would never think about in the Polish realities. And for example, there is also, as you said, there are some tips, some solutions being implemented about treating genders more equally. What is discussed, and I know it is discussed, it's textbooks for children in Polish schools. So it's also full of stereotypes, full of this old-fashioned approach, let's say, especially when it comes to family roles. So this is kind of a problem as well. But it's also the impact of tradition, and I am absolutely sure that lots of time is needed to change that. But I wanted to comment on the feminatives that appear in Polish. They are one of the most significant changes being introduced, and they are being sign of recent few years, nominating the professions, functions.
Just to jump in, just for everybody, Dorota is talking about the spread of the use of the feminine forms of professions that traditionally were always just appearing in a masculine form in Polish.
Yes, and I have to admit that I am absolutely against them, because for me, as for native speaker, they sound just very, very artificially. Okay. And I met recently a form. There is sportowiec, like a sportsman, and there was a form suggested in an exercise, sportowczyni, I guess. So yeah. This is a word that I can guarantee you that no native speaker would use ever. So this is also a big question, to which extent we can influence the natural development of the language. Yes, so this is why I'm giving the example with feminitives, because it's very easy. Potentially, they are very easily to be produced in the language. It's not the grammar, yes. It's not the system. It's not the morphological system. It's not syntaxes. So, and they have quite an easy patterns of being built. But still, is it still a natural development of the language? We will see. So it's also the question of kind of transformation, I would say. Yeah. So that's the comment.
Wonderful.
I think in that same relatedly in the Russian context, you have a similar conversation going on about these kinds of professions, and some native speakers are saying, I'm not going to use the feminine forms of these professional endings because it feels very, like you're saying, artificial, but also highlighting, even in English, people don't want to be called actresses because then it highlights the degree to which she's a woman actress. right? And so there's that conversation going on. And so something that I think we're also thinking about is how can we balance this teaching students in New York the language in a way that, you know, allows them to express their identity, but also express their identity in a way that's going to be understood if they go to Poland. Like, what are these students going to do if they have all these forms of quote unquote non-standard Polish or Polish that no one uses on the ground? And so we're trying to think about exactly how to ride that line and balance the needs of, you know, students going abroad, and then, you know, especially given the conservative government, if they're using certain pronouns and like just safety concerns as well. At least that was the case too, when talking to students about going abroad to Russia, for example, and using non-binary pronouns.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I see a question here from Fumiko.
Yes, actually, I have to go to another meeting, so quick question. I have been very much interested in this topic, and then I read many articles, but also my concern is that some students may feel very uncomfortable dealing with this kind of issues in a classroom, right? And what do you think about that point?
In my experience, that's a really good question, and one that I was just talking, even in the literature context, we're dealing with a lot of these questions of identity, and a student came to me saying that they were not used to talking about them in the classroom. And I think, at least in the language context, framing it in terms of an inclusivity of not, you know, silencing certain voices, or, you know, emphasizing, with at least talking about my own experience of not having the language to describe myself as, you know, African American or Black, or not knowing how to say, you know, where I come from, or where like even some of like my family comes from, or my just because if we think about like those little charts that they give you often are of, you know, how to describe someone who's from England or someone who's from France, they give you just limited European countries. So even just framing it in terms of something that doesn't feel quite as fraught or hyper political, of just giving language to people so that they can describe themselves to the same degree that, you know, someone who is white, cisgender.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. How about Utah? I see you have your hand up there.
Hold on. Yeah, oh, I wanted to lower my hand. I lowered it. Okay, so in German, we're already, now I'm applauding myself. Sorry, that was unintentional. In German, we're already a step farther. So we have a well-established female, you know, version for all kind of professions. But, you know, I'm finding myself now, well, that's not enough either, because we need something that is more gender neutral. And so we have an option that is more gender neutral, but it's not widely used either. So there was a survey at some point, and, you know, 30% of all businesses said they would use it, and the others said, we're not going to use this kind of language, you know. So so one can get used to the different forms. I think it might feel awkward at first, and then it becomes normal, and then it becomes outdated, which I think is really fascinating, you know. And to Fumiko's concern, you know, I always try to solve it by asking my students, you know, in a questionnaire at the beginning. You know, you can find out a lot of stuff, and but I think it is really important to create a community, like you said, have an inclusive setting, and also have everybody represented. But it is an issue. I mean, Germans have ideas about gender neutral pronouns, but like Polish, we're also, you know, very gendered. And we have to tell them, if you go to Germany and, you know, talk to people about wir instead of he, she, or it, people might not know what you're talking about depending on where you go. So, I mean, it is a big, you know, issue. That's all.
Yeah, yeah, Abdul, yeah.
In my case, since teaching Swahili, we don't have a issue of gender in the language. We don't have our third person, third person, singular and plural. They're totally neutral. Right? So we use the third person for and it could be man, woman, animal, or anything. and then wa for the plural of it and the object of it too. So I could write a sentence and you will not know if I'm talking about a man or woman or animal. Except for animal, it'll be a different kind of a situation. But in terms of men and women, we don't have that. And then we don't have our nouns and gender at all. So we are blessed on that side. And even on titles and so on of profession, they are all neutral too. You know, that we don't engender them. And the issue then comes into the cultural part is where the issue comes in. So you can have the language neutral, but the culture is where the big issue is. And now how do you interpret that culture into certain situations? So that's our issue is like students of mine who are in class right now, there are a couple of gay guys, three or four gay guys, and they won't say, but how do I neutralize it? I said, but it's neutral already. It's the third person, is he or she, it doesn't matter, you know? But I want it to be, I said, no, but the English has to define itself into he, she. They're using the same thing, he, she, him, her, and so on. I said, I wish those who were going to change this issue, they should have studied other languages that don't have gender in language, study them and adopt perhaps those type of models rather than abandoning he or she, him, and all of that, and then have something in place of it. But if not, then we still will be continuing with it.
Yeah. How are we doing on time, Simon?
Oh, we are doing great. I'm actually going to jump right in. So it is 4:02, which marks our 1 hour allotment. I know that some folks here have only an hour. So if you're one of those people, thank you so much for attending. I hope that it was useful to you. And if you'd like to rewatch it, it's going to be on our YouTube channel. However, if you would like to stay and continue this conversation, if our presenters, if our hosts are up for it, we can certainly do that. I myself have 3 questions that I would like to ask. So, yeah, you know.
Maybe jump in and just make a comment on about the situation of genderless languages.
Let me finish the recording because it is 4:03. So, yeah, again, thank you all for participating, and I hope to see all of you at our next meeting. Thank you.